As a child, I experienced a traumatic car accident that left me paralyzed and unable to communicate. I spent every moment in a hospital bed, trapped inside my own body. But that was just the beginning of my nightmare. At night, a shadow man would slip into my room and stare at me with his unblinking eyes. I was unable to move, scream, or even close my eyes. His twisted smile filled me with terror. For months, I was trapped in this nightmare, never sure if I was awake or dreaming. The shadow man haunted me, his presence always lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Doctors and nurses thought I was brain dead, but I was fully conscious during my entire hospital stay. I could hear everything, but I was unable to respond or communicate with anyone. It was a terrifying experience, feeling trapped inside my own body while the shadow man lurked in the darkness. Then, miraculously, I emerged from my coma, my body slowly healing. My parents brought me home, and I thought I had finally escaped the clutches of the shadow man. But that first night back in my own bed, I heard a noise at the foot of my bed. I opened my eyes to see the shadow man, his twisted grin filling me with dread. I tried to scream for help, but no sound escaped my lips. He crept closer and closer until I could feel his cold breath on my face. I was trapped, helpless, unable to escape his grasp. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. I was terrified of going to sleep, afraid the shadow man would return. But the worst part was that no one believed me. My parents thought I was just experiencing nightmares, and the doctors dismissed my claims as a result of the trauma from the accident. For years, I lived with the fear of the shadow man, never knowing when he would appear again. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But every time I closed my eyes, I could feel his presence, his eyes watching me from the darkness. As I grew older, I tried to move on from my trauma. I went to therapy, took medication, and tried everything I could to put the past behind me. But the shadow man never left me. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. Now, as an adult, I still struggle with the memory of the shadow man. I can still feel his presence, watching me from the darkness. I've learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of who I am. But every once in a while, when I'm alone in the dark, I can feel his eyes on me, and the fear comes flooding back. The shadow man is a part of me now, a constant reminder of the horror I have experienced. And even though I've tried to move on, he will always be there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down once again. There was a small, isolated town tucked away in the mountains. It was surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs, and the only way in or out was a narrow, winding road that was treacherous, even in the best of conditions. Few people visited the town, and those who did never stayed long. They said the air felt heavy and suffocating, and there was an eerie stillness that hung over the place like a shroud. But the locals knew the real reason for the town's ominous reputation. They whispered about a dark presence that dwelled in the mountains, a malevolent force that preyed on the town's inhabitants. Most dismissed the stories as mere superstition, but there were those who knew better. They had seen things in the darkness, heard whispers on the wind that chilled them to the bone. One night, a group of hikers decided to explore the mountains, eager to prove to themselves that the stories were nothing more than legend. They set out at sunset, determined to reach the summit before dawn. But as they climbed higher, the air grew thick with a sense of dread. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like the screams of the damned. And then they saw it, a dark figure lurking in the shadows, watching them with glowing eyes. The hikers tried to flee, but the figure pursued them relentlessly, its footsteps echoing through the mountains. They stumbled through the forest, branches scratching at their faces until they stumbled upon a clearing. But as they stepped into the clearing, they realized their mistake. They were surrounded by shadowy figures, each one watching them with cold, unfeeling eyes. And then the whispers started. whispers that spoke of death and suffering and eternal damnation. The hikers screamed, but their cries were drowned out by the howling wind. They ran, but the shadowy figures were everywhere, closing in on them from all sides. And then, in a moment of clarity, they realized that they were not alone in the darkness. The malevolent force that had haunted the town for generations had found them, and it would not let them go. The hikers tried to fight, but they were no match for the darkness that surrounded them. And in the end, they were consumed by the shadows, their souls claimed by the malevolent force that lurked in the mountains. It was a warm summer evening when 13-year-old Ben decided to venture into the woods behind his house. He had been camping with his family before and felt confident in his wilderness skills. But as the sun began to set, Ben realized he had gone farther than he had intended and was completely lost. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to find any familiar landmarks. As darkness descended, Ben's fear grew. Every rustle of the leaves, every snapping twig made him jump. And then he saw them, people in the trees. At first, Ben thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he stared into the darkness, he saw shadowy figures moving through the trees, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. He tried to move away, but no matter which direction he turned, the figures seemed to follow him. They whispered to each other in a language he couldn't understand, their voices growing louder and more menacing. Ben stumbled through the woods, his heart racing, sweat pouring down his face. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the figures in the trees were closing in on him. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, Ben saw a light in the distance. He ran towards it, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. As he burst through the trees, he saw a group of people standing around a campfire. They turned to look at him, their faces twisted into grotesque masks. Ben screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a log and falling to the ground. He felt hands on him, grabbing him, pulling him towards the fire. He fought and struggled, but it was no use. The figures in the trees had him now, and there was no escape. The last thing Ben saw before he lost consciousness was the faces of the figures in the trees, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. And then darkness consumed him as the woods echoed with the sound of his screams. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that sent shivers down your spine. Jane was driving home from work, her heart racing as she navigated the deserted roads. She had always been scared of storms, but this one felt different, almost ominous. As she approached a crossroads, her headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered black gown, her long hair whipping in the wind. Jane hit the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded on the wet road and crashed into a tree. When Jane came to, the woman was gone. But the storm had intensified, and she knew she needed to find shelter. She stumbled through the woods, her heart pounding with fear. And that's when she saw the house. It was a dilapidated old mansion, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. But it was the only shelter in sight. Jane pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from every corner. But as Jane made her way through the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And then she heard it. A soft whisper, almost too quiet to hear. Jane froze, her heart racing. She couldn't see anyone, but she could feel their eyes on her. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging Jane into total darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. And then she heard it again. The whisper, this time louder, more urgent. Jane tried to run, but she didn't know where she was going. She stumbled down the dark hallway, her breath coming in short gasps. And that's when she saw her. The woman in black, standing at the end of the hall. Jane tried to turn and run, but she couldn't move. It was like something was holding her in place. The woman took a step forward, and Jane could see her face for the first time. It was twisted and grotesque, with black eyes that seemed to stare into her soul. And then she started to move, slowly at first, and then faster and faster. Jane tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped, helpless, unable to escape the woman's grasp. As they hurtled down the hallway, Jane caught a glimpse of the other rooms in the house. They were filled with people, all dressed in black, all watching her with dead eyes. And then she knew. They were all ghosts, and she was trapped in their world. The woman in black stopped suddenly, and Jane crashed into her. She tried to push her away, but it was like pushing against a brick wall. And then the woman spoke, her voice cold and chilling. "You're mine now," she said, and then everything went black. Jane woke up in her car, the storm still raging outside. It took her a few moments to realize she had been dreaming, but the terror stayed with her for days. She knew she had to find a way to conquer her fear, or else the woman in black would come back for her, and this time she might not wake up.